There are essentially two kinds of stories. Stories that end well and stories that end badly. You probably have experienced both kinds of stories. I certainly have. Some of them I wish would never stop. They're so great. And others, well, I learned that it's good that they're done. The rear view mirror is a good thing sometimes, isn't it? You walk away from something and say, whew, glad I don't have to go through that one again. The Bible's filled with both kinds of stories. The story of David and Goliath takes the form of a ewe, something we've been talking about a little bit as we've been in the Gospel of John. It begins at the top of the ewe where everything's very calm and peaceful. David's a shepherd. He's at home. His brothers have gone off to fight, but he's just there with mom and dad, and life is pretty relaxed. But then he goes down into a place of great danger. He travels, brings food to his brothers who are fighting against the enemies, the Philistines, this superior power that had been oppressing them for hundreds of years. And when he gets there, he finds that the camp is in complete despair. The Philistines have trotted out their champion, a giant named Goliath, and everybody's afraid to even confront him. And so David walks into this place of hopelessness and cowardice, and where everyone is just afraid to even get up in the morning. And at the very bottom of that experience, here he is, right at that point where he senses God is saying, you're going to make a difference. But in order to make the difference, he has to be willing to be in that place of danger. In fact, to the point of walking out with nothing but a slingshot and 5 river stones. And talk about being at the bottom of the U. That's what it feels like. When it's just you and the giant. And the giant's got all of this fancy armor, and you've got your, one stone in the sling. And everybody thinks this isn't going to end well. This is going to be one of those stories that ended badly. Now, we know how the story turns out because David said, I'm not going to fight this battle. In fact, he says to Goliath, you're not even fighting me. You're taking on the God who created this world. And so David's willing to be very, very small and very, very weak. Seemingly so, huh? Just happens to also be a good shot. And he winds up that slingshot and lets that stone go. I don't know if you know, slingshots sound pretty tame to us because we're sort of used to the rubber band variety. But the slingshot in those days was made of strips of leather with a little sack or a pocket on the end. And you would swing this thing around and let that stone go. Malcolm Gladwell says that it had the force of a .44 Magnum bullet. Poor Goliath, he just had like one little patch of Goliath showing, and that's all the stone needed. And the story went from way, way down, all the way up to where, at the end of the story, David is experiencing peace and victory. He is now the champion of his country and on his way to becoming king. That's a story that begins well and ends well. I don't know about you, but that's the kind of story I want to live. But there's another kind of story. It's the upside down story, the upside down you. And when we look at the king by the name of Saul, who was the king over David and his people at that time, we find that that king lived the opposite story of David. King Saul came into his kingship at a time when he and his people were at the bottom of that U. It's a time of anarchy, a time of oppression and violence. The Philistines, again, had been basically running the show. And so the people were desperate to have more unity, to have someone bring them together. If we can have that next slide. I don't know if it's going to come up. Whoops. Other way. There we go. It was a time of national crisis. And so God had this man Saul anointed by Samuel, and he rises to great prominence. He wins great victories. It looks like everything is going well. It looks like this is what we've been longing for. But then something goes wrong. Saul gets full of Saul. Saul begins to become arrogant. He becomes a tyrant. Eventually he becomes very jealous of David. He becomes very paranoid. He goes over to the dark side. He turns his back on his relationship with God. He forgets that God brings the victories. And now Saul thinks he can do this on his own. And when that happens, there at the very top of his fame and his power, at the top of the U, he begins a long, terrible fall. And the last chapters that tell the story of Saul are some of the darkest and saddest chapters in the entire Bible. He tries to kill David. He turns against those who are his loved ones. At the end, he makes a deal with the devil just to find out what his future is going to be. He calls forth, goes to a witch to call forth the spirit of Samuel to find out whether he's going to live or die the next day. He gets the bad news and commits suicide on the battlefield. And so really, with the story of Saul, again, we end where we began, a place of national disgrace, and humiliation, and defeat. There was Saul, so much potential, but because he was full of Saul, he couldn't make it work, and he collapsed back down. Two kinds of stories. The David story takes us down and brings us up. The Saul story takes us up and brings us down. Which kind of story do you want to live? Which kind of story have you lived? Well, the night before Jesus died was a night filled with that fear and danger and chaos, much like what David walked into when he came to the battle lines against Goliath. In the middle of the Passover meal, Jesus broke the news that one of the innermost circle of the disciples, one of the 12, the closest people to him on this earth, would betray him to the authorities, would rat him out. And when he was asked who it would be, Jesus turned to John and whispered, "It'll be the person to whom I give a piece of bread." He gave the piece of bread to Judas, as you know the story, and Satan emerged out of the shadows to possess him. The die was cast. And John ends the scene by saying in John 13:30, as soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. Now, all of this was too much for Peter. Peter was the one who wanted to know who the bad guy was going to be. Peter was the leader. Peter was the guy who was always saying, hey, I've got a plan. We can make this work. Peter wanted to be the hero. And he wanted to make things right. And when Jesus warned Peter that he couldn't fix this problem, said, well, you can't follow me on this journey I'm taking. Peter protested in John 13:37, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. Now, Peter had heard those words before because Jesus had talked about being the good shepherd. And he said, the good shepherd does what? He lays down his life for the sheep. He isn't just a victim. He isn't just someone who finds himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. He, of his own free will, shows the greatest love a human can show for someone else, and he willingly lays his life down. Jesus said, greater love has no person than that he lays down his life for his friends. So here's Peter saying, I am that person. I am going to show the greater love. Jesus, even if everybody else runs away from you, you can count on me. I'll lay my life down for you. Poor Peter. He thought the only way to defeat evil was to take matters into his own hands. None of us have ever done that, have we? Jesus tried to warn him that it would end up badly. He said, hey, before this night is out, you keep going down that path, you're going to deny that you even know I exist. You're not going to lay your life down for anybody. Peter's, oh, no, you'll see. He was determined to save the day. Now, later that night, John tells us that when the soldiers came to arrest Jesus, it was Peter who pulled out the sword and chopped somebody's ear off. He was going to save the day or the night. When the disciples ran away, Jesus and John followed Jesus. Peter and John followed Jesus. The scripture says he followed down the dark streets, following the band of soldiers, and saw where Jesus was taken prisoner, where they were going to conduct the kangaroo court that would condemn him to death. And Peter found a way to get in, got into the courtyard, got as close to Jesus as he could get. What was going on in Peter's head? He was saving the day. He was remembering those words, I will lay down my life for you. And so he was keeping his word and using all of the courage and all of the strength and all of the pride and all of the arrogance that was inside of him to try to make this thing work. But when a servant girl put him on the spot, he melted like a pat of butter on a hot stove. Sure enough, 3 times, not once, not twice, 3 times he denied even knowing that Jesus existed. And then, just as Jesus had predicted, a rooster crowed. Jesus died that day. Peter did not. So what happened? Well, Peter's story was the upside-down you. It began in fear and danger. Peter took his stand. I will lay down my life for you. Tried to follow Jesus, but when he found himself facing possible torture and death, he folded up and slipped away into the night. And so there's Peter's story. It begins with failure, it ends with failure. The good news is that God doesn't leave us in our broken, upside-down stories. No matter how much we mess things up, and we all do, no matter how many upside-down stories we have, and maybe that we're even living right now, no matter how often that happens, even though we're trying to do the right thing most of the time, He offers to come and turn those stories right side up. So wherever you are in your life right now, whatever is going on, whether it's a story of your own making or of someone else's making, and you say, this thing is just going from bad to I thought it was better to worse, and I don't see any way to get out of this. Or maybe you might even be thinking, I deserve what I'm getting. I knew I was doing the wrong thing when I took matters into my own hands, when I forgot what God's Word says to do, and I decided to write my own rules, or when whatever it was that you might have done. You might say, I don't deserve to have God come and turn the story over. Well, I want to just clarify for you right now. Of course, none of us do deserve that. But God loves us and forgives us, and He delights in turning upside-down stories right side up. That's what God does. And what a beautiful thing to see Peter with the story of total failure become a person whose story gets turned right side up. The turnaround happened for Peter when he joined Jesus for breakfast on the beach. This was after Jesus had been raised from the dead. We talked about it last week, about how Jesus helped the disciples catch fish and kind of reinstituted that friendship and that relationship. Well, there was a lot of work to do with Peter, because Peter knew that he had denied he even knew Jesus 3 times, and he had made such a bold promise. After they finished eating, Jesus took Peter aside. He asked him a question. In John 21:15, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Now, when Peter had become a follower of Jesus, Jesus had given him the nickname Peter, which meant the rock. Didn't really apply at this point. Probably could have said, hey, sand or mud, come over here. Because he wasn't the rock now. What he does is Jesus refers to him in his formal name, his formal birth name. It's the name he would have used if he were talking to Peter as a stranger. In a sense, he is saying, come on, let's start this relationship all over again. We're back at square one. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And when Jesus asks the questions about loving me more than these, I wonder if there isn't a touch of irony. Remember, Peter had been the one who said, even if all of these guys forsake you, I will follow you. I'll lay down my life for you. I love you more than these do. I wonder if here Jesus isn't saying, so, how did it work out? Do you love me more than these? All Peter can say, verse 15 is, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus asks him 3 times, one for every denial. Not to be cruel, but to pull the sting. By the 3rd time, Peter has definitely picked up on the pattern. And John tells us Peter was grieved. 3 confessions of love to counteract 3 denials. And you know something? Peter can do nothing to prove his point. This isn't about Peter going out and showing Jesus how great Peter is. All he can say is, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. I blew it. I got full of myself. I tried to make myself bigger and more important than these other guys around me. But you know who was inside. You know that scared little kid that was inside that couldn't accept being afraid that night. Didn't want to appear weak. You know all things. You know that I love you. You see what Jesus is doing with Peter? He's taking him back to one of the most important things in the whole Bible. Well, what is that? Well, it comes back to a question that Jesus was asked one time at least, probably many times. When a teacher came up to him and said, okay, Rabbi, what is the greatest commandment? If you had to sum up everything you need to know, everything about our faith, everything to get us on the right track, what's the greatest commandment? And you know what Jesus said the answer was? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul, your mind, and your strength. Deuteronomy 6:5 is where we first find it. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. In that original version, there are three ways, huh? Your heart, your soul, your strength. I wonder if Jesus asked Peter 3 times, take him back to the great commandment. See, let's get back to the most important thing. Peter, do you love me with all your heart? Peter, do you love me with all your soul? Peter, do you love me with all your strength? You see, there at the very bottom of the U now, in that place where Peter is forced to face his own brokenness and his emptiness and his failure, Peter learns that the only thing that matters is that he rediscover his love for God with all his heart, soul, and strength. When you and I are finding ourselves in a place where the chaos is all around us, and maybe we look at ourselves and go, and I'm the biggest cause for this mess that I've made. Simply piling on more guilt, or getting mad at others and casting blame, or doing all of the things that we tend to want to do, doesn't fix anything, just creates more chaos. At that point, where we feel about this big, or maybe underground about this far, at that point, isn't it interesting, when God comes to us, the first thing he asks is, do you love me? Not, have you figured it out? Not, are you perfect? Not, can't you see what a goof you are? Can't you see how terrible you are now? It's not the backhand that brings shame and reproach, but instead, let's start at square one. Let's start with the greatest commandment. Do you love me? What matters most? And Peter could say, despite all my failures, despite all the things I did wrong, you know what? The one thing that matters most is you, Lord. You know that. I've come to see that over the last days and weeks of dealing with my guilt and my shame. I've realized that no matter how badly I messed up, I still love you, Lord. I was trying to love you. I just did it in the wrong way. There's more to the story than simply being reconciled, than simply getting to the great commandment. Jesus then gives him a purpose and a mission for his life. And he does that in the context of each of those 3 questions. Do you love me? John 21, in verse 15, verse 16, verse 17, after the question and Peter's answer comes a command. Feed my lambs. Take care of my sheep. Feed my sheep. Be a shepherd. You see what Jesus is doing here? He is entrusting to Peter his supreme work. In John 10, Jesus defined himself as the good shepherd. And now he is saying, Peter, I'm appointing you to be a shepherd in my place. This is the same Peter who played the role of the hired man. When the wolf came, he ran. He didn't stand there by the sheep. He didn't lay his life down for anybody. But now Peter's a different person. One who will nurture and care for God's people. This is an amazing thing for Jesus to say to Peter. Peter had said, I will be the good shepherd. I'll lay my life down. Peter had become the opposite of a good shepherd. The hired man who ran away because the sheep weren't his, went and saved his own skin. If anybody didn't qualify to be the shepherd, hey, that guy, don't hire him. And Jesus says, look, if we can get the first step right, the great commandment that you love me, I'm going to give you the biggest assignment I can possibly give you. Now think about that in your life. You know, we can look at ourselves and go, well, I failed at X and Y and Z, so I'll never be doing those things. You never know what God might have up his sleeve. He might say, you know, actually, I made you for X, Y, and Z. No. Yeah, but if we get the first thing right, you love me first more than yourself, you'd be amazed at what I can do through you. And so what's the future for Peter and his story? Well, Jesus ends the conversation by pointing the way forward. Begins with a very solemn announcement, verses 18 and 19. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you're old, you'll stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. You could kind of picture the scene. Many have read this scene and pictured the fact that by stretching out his arms, Peter himself would suffer crucifixion, and that is exactly what we are told from the various stories that have come down of how Peter's life ended. And then he said to him, "Follow me." See, Peter will not be defined or remembered for his failure. Instead, like his master, he will bring glory to God even in the way he leaves this world. He's going to be a faithful shepherd. He's going to be willing to lay his life down for the sheep, not just on one occasion, but all through his life now. He's going to be the person who goes the extra mile, who steps out of his comfort zone, who is willing to do things that others don't understand so that he can lay his life down for someone that belongs to Jesus. Now, I've been challenging you, and I challenge myself, to think about our story. We each have to find our own way and find our own story. Nobody can write your story for you. Nobody can tell you how to live and what to do in each situation. Only God can do that. It never works to envy or try to emulate somebody else. Do you ever try to copy somebody else's thing, you know? I remember doing this myself and working with some young pastors back some years ago. I remember talking to them and how they would study a particular preacher. Like go on YouTube or whatever, or get videos or whatever, and they'd say, "Oh, I just love the way that person does it." And so they would copy that person's style and mannerisms and accent and shout when they shouted and be quiet when they were quiet and so on. What were they trying to do? They're trying to basically find a way to succeed and go forward. And of course, what happened over time was and all of us who have ever done anything in public have learned that in the end, you can't find that from somebody else. You got to find it for yourself. If you're working on a marriage, you will find that you just can't make your marriage be exactly like a marriage you read about in a book or that you see perhaps modeled by your friends or even by someone in the media. You can learn from other people, but you got to work out the details yourself. You can't raise your kids exactly the way other people raise their kids. Your kids aren't the same as theirs, and you aren't the same as the parents. You can learn. We can all learn from each other. But comparing ourselves to each other is just a recipe for disaster. Absolute recipe for disaster. And Peter faced that temptation to compare himself to someone else when he learned what it would mean for him to be a shepherd. This lay down my life thing was more prophetic than he realized. So he looks over his shoulder at John, the other disciple in the story, and says, verse 21, I love these words, "Lord, what about him?" Ever been there? What about them? You want me to do this? Well, what are they doing? It's kind of like we do that when we have kids, right? When we were kids, or we hear that from our kids, Okay, I want you to wash the car. Well, what's she going to do? Right? Can see the twists and turns of our story, and we compare them to somebody else who may be getting a better deal, or so it looks. Is their story going to be as hard as mine? You're going to stretch me out, and they're going to take me where I don't want to go. Sounds really bad, really ugly. And I'm going to glorify God with my death? I'm a young man. I'm trying to do something with this life, and you haven't really said what's going to happen to him. What are they going to do with him? Jesus gives some very kind words. Basically, it's none of your business. And those words apply to us just as much. Yeah, but what about... Thus saith the Lord. None of your business. Ooh, that was rude. You think so? I'll say it again. None of your business. That's what Jesus says to Peter. He basically says in verse 22, if I want him to remain alive till I return, what is that to you? You must follow me. Get your eyes on me. Get your eyes off of everybody else. You will never follow God by trying to follow somebody other than God. Or by trying to suggest to God that if it could just be like so-and-so's life, or so-and-so's salary, or so-and-so's this, or so-and-so's that, or if only I had people that were doing this for me or that for me, if I only had that, then this would all work out. Jesus says, hey, follow me. Very, very simple. And that goes back to that first commandment. Do you love me more than all the rest of this stuff? The only way to find the story that turns the you right side up is to follow Jesus. He is the only one who knows the way to get the story back to where it needs to be. So where's your story headed? Who's your hero in your story? Is it all about you? Seems that that's the way it works in our society. Put yourself out there, be your own hero, show them who's boss. You know, if you're feeling a little insecure, take 4 more selfies and change your profile picture. That'll fix everything. Right? And we live in a world that just says basically, be your own booster. Remind the world constantly of how important you are. Because our world story is the upside down story. You got problems, you're in a mess, you don't feel like life is where you want to be. Go do what you have to do, take what you have to take, say what you have to say, get yourself to the top of the pile, and then see how long you can last up there. But we all know how those stories end. Nobody ever stays at the top. So are you ready to discover the story that God has for your life? And even if you've been a person of faith and you said, well, I've been walking with Jesus for a long time, you're still in a story right now. And that story still has the chance of being upside down or right side up. Remember, God's story goes down before it goes up. Or, shall we say, we must first accept the reality of our brokenness before we can move forward. It's a story that turns our entire being away from self and focuses on love for God. That's the essence of the difference between the two stories. Look at the stories in our society today. Look who's the champion. Look who's important. It's always the person. It's always about the self. Look at God's story, and you see a person like a David who looks at the giant and says, boy, you picked the wrong person to fight today because you're not fighting me. You're fighting the God that I love. And He's going to give you to me today. That's how stories get turned right side up. I don't know what your Goliath is. I don't know what it is that you're looking at that you're saying that's too big for me. Or, oh, I've got to put on somebody else's armor and march out there and at least try to pretend that I can handle the situation. But I got good news for you. You don't have to do that. God's going to use you just the way you are in your weakness. Like Paul said, when I'm weak, I'm strong. He's going to use you if you put your trust in Jesus. If you love God with all your heart, soul, and strength. Second thing about this story that God has for you is it always involves laying your life down for others. It involves serving. It involves giving. It involves loving. It involves forgiving. It involves realizing that we're all going through this thing. We're not keeping score. Like, oh, I think I did better than him, her, and her today. Okay, Lord, how many points is that? Where are we at in the standings? That's not how God sees it. Life isn't the playoffs. We're in this together. Our leader gave it all up. Gave it all up so that we could succeed and be saved. And most of all, this is a story about following, not leading. It means every morning we get up and we say, okay, Lord, where are we going? Not, oh God, do I have an idea for you today? Lord, if you just come down here and sit down, I thought this through last night, and I know how we can fix the problem. Just read my notes. The Lord says, I'm here. And we say, where are we going? Are you ready for that story? Well, Jesus is waiting. And he even serves breakfast as he offers it to you. And this morning, as we come to the table of the Lord here, and I invite all of you to come and receive the bread and the cup. This is a chance to embrace God's story. Now, it's very fascinating. Judas got the bread, didn't he? And the wine, because the bread was dipped in the wine. He had the chance to embrace God's story. When Jesus gave that bread to him, Judas could have said, I love you more than what I'm thinking of doing. He chose the wrong story. Jesus wasn't setting him up. Jesus was giving him one last chance. When Peter failed, Jesus said, hey, here's some bread. Here's some fish. Let's get started on this story. Let's turn this thing around, Peter. You're going to change the world. And so this morning, as you come and take the bread and the cup, I want to encourage you to be saying, Lord, wherever I'm at, whatever situation, whatever might be down the road, I'm choosing your story. I'm going to love you. I'm going to lay my life down, and I'm going to follow you wherever you have to go. Simple. Brings us to where God meant for us to be. We let Jesus be the hero.